Okay, what went wrong for Georgia in 2024? This is a series of videos I'm going to do talking about a few different teams. Feel free to let me know down below if there's a team you'd like to see me talk about in this type of a video. We're going to start with Georgia today. Now, what went wrong with the team is relative in a lot of ways to several different things. Like just as an example of something I'm not going to do. Like, I'm not going to do what went wrong with SMU. You know, in SMU's first year as a Power 4 or Power 5 team, they played for an SEC championship, nearly came back and won it, made the playoffs. Yes, they lost in the first round of the playoffs, but nobody looks at SMU and goes, man, can't believe they only made it to the playoffs and lost. Like, what's wrong with them? I'm not talking about that. This will be, Georgia, a team that, had varying level of expectation, I guess, depending on where you looked in the offseason or the preseason. They were ranked in the top 2 or 3 of every single preseason ranking in the country at various points throughout the season. They were the odds-on favorite to win the national title. Going into the season, they had a quarterback that was considered to be a Heisman contending quarterback and a potential first-round draft pick. And you sort of fast forward to the end of the season, and a lot of those things obviously did not come to fruition. That's the kind of team I want to talk about in this series of videos. So if you've got a team that you'd like to hear me talk about in this type of a way, let me know down below. But we are going to start with Georgia. Now, Georgia goes 10-2 in the regular season. They win the SEC. They make the playoffs, losing in the second round to Notre Dame after having a first round bye in the playoffs. So they lost their first playoff game, but it was the second round of the playoffs because of the bye system and the bye structure, and them winning the SEC gave them that first round bye. There was a lot of talk heading into the season about Georgia's difficult schedule, particularly on the road. They played Alabama on the road, Texas on the road, and Ole Miss on the road. They played 2 additional top 15 teams, Tennessee at home, Clemson in a neutral site. So when you look at Georgia's schedule sort of in the preseason and even now after it's all said and done, there's really 5 games that sort of stood out, and they're the ones I just named. Clemson, Alabama, Texas, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. All 5 of those teams are top 15-ish type teams, top 20 maybe in the case of Clemson, heading into the season, and they finished that way. 3 of those 5 teams Georgia played on the road. A 4th they played on a neutral site. Only 1 of the 5 did Georgia play at home. So given all of that, I don't think the 10-2 regular season record for Georgia in and of itself is really that bad. It's actually a pretty good record given the schedule that they had and the level of competition that they played over the course of the season. They really didn't lose any games that were shocking. And a lot of teams did, right? Now, maybe you think Georgia should have beat Bama, should have beat Ole Miss, right? And they didn't. But it wasn't a shock that they lost to those 2 teams. Those were considered to be 2 pretty good teams. Again, ranked teams, top 15, 20-ish type teams. They didn't have, and this video is not to pick on any team, not even Georgia in this case, even though this video is about Georgia. But just to point out sort of what I mean by not losing, none of their losses were shocking, right? They didn't. It's not Notre Dame losing to Northern Illinois or Alabama losing to Vandy. And again, that's not to pick on Notre Dame. Notre Dame obviously just beat Georgia. They're a hell of a team. They're headed to the semifinals of the playoffs to take on Penn State. But when you look at Georgia's losses, they didn't have that. So the regular season, given the schedule that they had, I think if you'd asked most Georgia fans heading into the season, they would have said, yeah, I'll take 10-2 and a trip to the SEC championship game. And that's what ended up happening. I had Georgia at 11-1, ended up going 10-2. So I was a game off there. They make the SEC championship game. They beat Texas, their second win over Texas this season, the first one coming in Austin, and then the first round bye, and then the Sugar Bowl against Notre Dame where they came up short. So what happened? What went wrong with Georgia? Why isn't Georgia playing next week in the semifinals? Why not specifically did they lose the Notre Dame game, but more over the course of the season? What was it about Georgia that kind of went wrong? Well, you had a few key position groups, I think, on Georgia's team that looked one way on paper heading into the season and looked a different way sort of as the season played out and into the postseason. And we'll start with the wide receivers. Now, Georgia didn't have a wide receiver room that people looked at in the offseason and went, wow, that's amazing. They've got these 3 NFL wide receivers, or it didn't look like Ohio State's wide receiver room or whatever. But you had some known commodities in that wide receiver room. You had a lot of wide receivers with a lot of experience in that wide receiver room. Arian Smith, Dominic Lovett, Dylan Bell, Dominic Lovett, and Arian Smith. You had a couple of you had Ra Smith, who was supposed to come back this year. You added Colby Young to the mix, a kind of a tall outside type of guy. And you had maybe some optimism for Georgia's wide receivers heading into the season. That obviously ended up not being the case. Georgia's wide receiver room as a whole this season is probably one of the worst I've ever seen Georgia have. And Georgia's not a team that traditionally has had loaded wide receiver rooms. I'm talking over the course of Georgia history. Sort of infamously, Georgia has only ever had one wide receiver in its program history go over 1,000 yards. And that was Terrence Edwards way back in 2002. They've had a handful of, I guess, what you would consider to be elite level wide receivers. Hines Ward did a little bit of that. Of course, Terrence Edwards in the early 2000s, A.J. Green in the late 2000s. You had George Pickens sort of in the late 20-teens into sort of early 2020s. A.D. Mitchell, I think, was a pretty good. I don't know if he's quite at the level of like an A.J. Green or a George Pickens type, but he was a really talented guy. He, of course, played a couple of years at Georgia, then ended up transferring out to Texas. Ladd McConkey, who Georgia had the last couple of years and has gone off to the NFL now, ended up being a really good college level slot wide receiver and has turned out to be a pretty good NFL wide receiver too. That was sort of a needle in the haystack type of deal. He was a 3-star wide receiver, didn't have any Power 5 offers at all. He sort of just ends up at Georgia almost by default. And I don't think anybody, Ladd McConkey, the Georgia coaching staff, I don't think anybody thought Ladd McConkey was going to turn into what he did, but he did. So you got to put him sort of in that list too. But the receivers that Georgia were bringing back this year, none of those receivers were that. But you were hoping with the combination of experience and transfer portal and sort of the size you were getting from a Colby Young and a Ra Thomas on the outside, combined with maybe what Dylan Bell could do for you at a slot or a Dominic Lovett at the slot, and the potential of Arian Smith, which turned out to be never really anything but potential. I mean, never achieved it really. You were kind of hoping that, okay, maybe the Georgia wide receivers with this potential first round quarterback in Carson Beck, maybe Georgia can have some sort of, significant passing game. And I don't want to downplay Georgia's passing game altogether over the course of the season. Carson Beck, outside of the interception issue that plagued him during the sort of middle of the season, I think had a pretty good year, but Georgia ended up leading the country in drop passes. And it was a problem that started in week 1 against Clemson and ended in the Sugar Bowl loss to Notre Dame and happened just about every single game in between. And it wasn't just one wide receiver. It seemed to be the entire room, really. You combine that with losing 2 of what Georgia had planned to be their biggest sort of weapons on the outside of that wide receiver group, Ra Thomas and Colby Young, sort of some bigger wide receiver, bigger body types. Ra Thomas dismissed before the season started. Colby Young dismissed 4 or 5 weeks into the season, whatever it was. And Georgia was left with basically a wide receiver room full of average to below average slot receivers, a bunch of undersized, sort of just honestly not very good wide receivers, as it turned out. Again, hope into optimism or preseason versus the reality of the season and what we know now looking back don't always line up, and this is the case with Georgia's wide receiver group. There wasn't a single wide receiver, or tight end for that matter, on Georgia's roster that an opposing defense or an opposing defensive coordinator had to game plan for or worry about or scheme against. Your best bet, honestly, as a defensive coordinator was just kind of leave the receivers open and let them drop the passes, because that's just what tended to happen more times than not. So obviously to play at the wide receiver position is one of the things that went severely wrong for Georgia in the 2024 season, as opposed to sort of the preseason expectations of what that might look like. The second thing I think you can look to, and this might actually be a bigger overall issue for Georgia this year than even the wide receiver drops or whatever, and that was the play of the offensive line. For years under Kirby Smart, Georgia has had one of the best offensive lines in college football, big NFL bodies across the board, in some cases too deep at a lot of positions, and that just wasn't the case this year. I think the talent was there from a recruiting level standpoint. Like if you look at the 24/7 recruiting ranking of a lot of these guys that Georgia trotted out on the offensive line, it was sort of close to the same type of player that Georgia had been recruiting in years past. None of them really ever lived up to it. There were some injuries there along the offensive line as well, but that's something that every team in the country has to face at some point during the season, whether it's with their offensive line, their defensive backs, their wide receivers, whatever the case. No one makes it through a college football season without injuries. That's why you have 85 scholarships and not 11 or 22. So while it's true Georgia had some injuries there, it's also true that even the guys that were playing, even the starters, they just weren't as talented. They weren't as good overall as the offensive line play we are used to seeing Georgia have over the last really 5, 6, 7, 8 years. There's no Andrew Thomas to anchor that line. There's no Isaiah Wilson. Tate Ratledge might be the best of the bunch. And is he a mid-round guy? As far as the NFL goes, 3, 4, where's the first round draft pick on Georgia's offensive line? Like, there's not one. It's not there. And in some instances, left tackle being chief amongst them, it's not even the fact that it wasn't up to the level of what we're used to seeing. It was downright bad. And it showed in several games this year, the Ole Miss game, the Notre Dame game. And left tackle is probably the most important piece along an offensive line. Obviously, the center is very important as well. But, left tackles are some of the highest paid offensive linemen in the NFL for a reason. You're protecting the quarterback's blind side in a lot of cases with right-handed quarterbacks. Georgia really struggled there this year. Showed, again, multiple times this season, particularly that Ole Miss game and, of course, the Notre Dame game, which led to the strip sack fumble at the end of the first half that Notre Dame then capitalized on with a touchdown to sort of blow that game open there at the end of the first half. That offensive line underperforming and not playing up to the level that we're used to seeing Georgia offensive lines play at led to a host of other issues. Number one, the running game, which was basically non-existent for Georgia for the entirety of this season. And what's particularly weird or strange or even frustrating, I think, about that is when you look back over Georgia's modern history, so you say the last 40, 50 years, something like that, Georgia hasn't always been a premier program in college football. They haven't always been a top 5, a top 10, and honestly, in some periods, not even a top 25 type program over certain periods of time. You look at the majority of the 90s, Georgia struggled to get into the top 25. That changed a little in the 2000s when Rick came in, became sort of a top 15-ish, a lot of times top 10-ish type team. And of course, Kirby has elevated that to another level. But the point I'm getting at here with the offensive line is, and even the sort of so-called lean years from Georgia, maybe the 90s, parts of the 2000s or whatever, even into the early 2010s, honestly, in sort of the end of Mark Richt's run. One of the things that you sort of just could rely on and count on, and you never even really had to think about, regardless of how good or bad of an overall team Georgia was, you knew they were going to be able to run the ball, and you knew they were going to have a couple of NFL running backs. I went through the list before, but like going all the way back to like 2012 at Georgia, you had at least one, and in some cases, 3 of the following running backs on the team at the University of Georgia in all of these years, starting in 2012. Todd Gurley, Keith Marshall, Sony Michel, Nick Chubb, DeAndre Swift, James Cook, Kenny McIntosh. And I'm leaving a few out. And the Kenny McIntosh thing takes us up to 2022. Last year and this year, the running back position at Georgia, I think, has taken a step backwards in terms of total talent in the running back room. I think that's just pretty obvious. Again, it's no shade towards a guy like Kendall Milton, who played last year, or, Etienne, who came in this year from Florida, who I think does have some talent and some potential. The bar had been set sort of so high at the running back position at Georgia that it was almost hard to believe what we were seeing this year when it came to Georgia's run game. Now, part of that was scheme and philosophy. A decision was obviously made in the offseason by the coaching staff, Kirby and the offensive staff led by Mike Bobo, to transition, at least for this season, to more of a drop-back passing team as opposed to a run-first team. And that was reflected in sort of the play percentages for Georgia this year. Georgia's typically like a 60% run, 40% pass type of team. Those numbers were flip-flopped this year. Georgia actually threw the ball more often than they ran the ball. Again, a lot of that was by design, I think, all offseason and heading into the season to utilize what they perceived to be their best player on offense, which was quarterback Carson Beck, who's a sort of prototypical old school drop back pocket passer, big, tall, strong arm, make all the throws. Let's cater our offense towards that, as opposed to, let's run the ball 35 times a game and beat teams up, which is what we've seen Georgia do for 40 plus years going back, right? Well, the season starts and the wide receivers can't catch a pass, which we just talked about. Carson Beck starts to get the interception bug. And so you go, well, it's time to shift towards the run game. Well, then it turns out you don't have that either. The offensive line failed numerous games to open up holes for the running backs. And again, it's a two-parted problem there. I don't think it's fair to just point out that the running backs may not be up to the same level that UJ is used to having, which is obviously true. That is true. Again, and I like ETN. I like Nate Frazier. I think they looked good at times this year, but they're not what we've had in the past. But I don't think it's fair to place all the blame on them, because clearly the offensive line struggled against any good competition it faced this year in terms of defensive fronts. The Tennessee game is really the only Georgia game that I can point to where I feel like the offensive line came anywhere close to playing to what we thought it would be. Tennessee's got a pretty good defensive front, maybe the best defensive front in the SEC. And in that Georgia-Tennessee game, Georgia did a really good job in both run protection and pass protection, which we'll talk about next, in sort of handling Tennessee in that game in Athens. Outside of that, I thought overall the run blocking was just way below where it needs to be for the University of Georgia. Sticking with the offensive line, the pass protection, again, something that was an issue more times than not this season, particularly when we faced a team with elite outside edge guys. Now, look, I get it. Elite outside edge guys are elite because they tend to beat their blocks more often than not. So, like, in other words, you can have an All-American left tackle and an All-American right outside linebacker, right? Well, if the right outside linebacker beats that left tackle and gets a sack, does that mean the left tackle is not any good? Or does it mean the right outside linebacker is really good, right? And if the left tackle shuts down that All-American right outside linebacker, does it mean the right outside linebacker was terrible? Or does it mean the left tackle was really good? So I get it that Georgia got beat by some really good edge rushers. But the point is, if you've got a really good left tackle, you're going to win some of those. And Georgia just lost way too many of those battles this year in big games against teams like Ole Miss specifically and Notre Dame. Monroe Freeling, it just was put on roller skates in multiple games this year. And Georgia tried to switch things up. They played Ernest Green out there. They played some other guys out there. They sort of switching up the pieces on the offensive line there, kind of trying to figure out what would work best. But again, that points to kind of another issue, which is if you're playing football in the middle of December after 12 regular season games and an SEC championship, or hell, the beginning of January, so you've been playing football for 4 months, and you're still kind of trying to figure out who your best 5 offensive linemen are, like, that's a problem. That's what April is for. That's what June, July, and August is for. Like, figure that out then. If you're in a situation where you're in the postseason trying to figure out who your best 5 offensive linemen are, you probably don't have 5 best offensive linemen. And I think that was one of Georgia's issues this season. On the defensive side of the ball, Georgia was not as good defensively as they were in sort of the heyday of the 21 and 22 years when they were, it seemed like they had 20 first-round NFL draft picks over there. At every level of the defense, Jordan Davis and Trayvon Walker and Nakobe Dean and Roquan and all the guys in the secondary, it wasn't that. But I do feel like Georgia defensively had a good enough defense this year to get them where they wanted to go. To me, it was the offense that kind of let Georgia down this year. And again, that doesn't mean the defense was perfect. I think Georgia needs to get better in the trenches along the defensive line. We saw a lot of teams this year when they decided to just kind of play big boy ball against Georgia and sort of run it between the tackles have a pretty good amount of success. The Notre Dame game, Jeremiah Love's one of the best running backs in the country. Riley Leonard's one of the best running QBs in the country. And while I think Georgia defensively did a good job at preventing explosive plays against those two guys in that game, I don't think either one of them had a carry for over 10 yards. And most of their carries were 3 or 4 yards. But that sort of became the problem, especially at the end of the game against Notre Dame. When you're running out of time, you're trying to get the ball back, and Notre Dame's just lining up and running quarterback draws and handoffs to Jeremiah Love up the middle over and over and over and over and over again. Everybody knows it's coming. Georgia's coaching staff knows it's coming. The players know it's coming. Everybody in the stands and watching on TV knows it's coming. And Georgia just doesn't, they just can't stop it. So while I don't think Georgia's defensive line was necessarily a weakness or a liability, it clearly, I don't think, was up to the level of what Georgia's defensive lines have been in the years past. A little disappointed in the inside linebackers too. Smile Munden's a really good player. I think C.J. Allen's a really good player. I expected more out of C.J. Allen this year than what I got. I thought he would make a bigger leap forward. He's a sophomore, played a lot as a true freshman last year, started a lot as a true freshman last year. He's the reason Pop Johnson transferred to Kentucky. And while he played good, he's not the next Nakobe Dean. He's not the next Roquan Smith. I mean, that's pretty obvious from watching this year. So again, it's a situation where these guys are good. They're not bad. And in a lot of cases, they're going to get shots in the NFL, but they're not what Georgia had. And I think there was some preseason optimism, sort of some, well, you know, they've lost people before. The next ones go in and you don't miss a beat type of thing. You kind of just expected that. And it ended up not being the case. Malachi Starks, an All-American safety in the preseason. I thought he had his worst season. Again, is he terrible? No, he's probably going to be a first-round draft pick. But can you name a memorable play all season long that Malachi Starks made? Just one? I can't. I can name memorable plays he made 2 years ago, an interception in the first game against Oregon or last year, or whatever. But I look at Malachi Starks this year, should have been the leader of that defensive secondary, a true junior, a 3-year starter. The guy started right away as a true freshman against Oregon, had been playing for 3 years straight. And he's just kind of, I mean, it was, you know, just nothing special. Again, he's a great player. He's going to be a first rounder. Michael Williams, great player, going to be a first rounder. Outside of the Texas game, did he even play this year? Michael Williams? Where was he? You know, Jalen Walker, who I don't think has anywhere close to the ability of a Michael Williams, won the Butkus Award as the best linebacker. And again, outside of a couple of Texas games, even with him, where's the real impact that these guys made? So it's a lot of really good players. It's a lot of NFL players. It's a lot of 3rd, 4th, and 5th round NFL players, though. Not the 1st and 2nd rounders that we've seen in years past. I don't think there's a single first rounder on this Georgia offense. Not Carson Beck, not Etienne, not any of the offensive linemen, certainly none of the wide receivers. So what went wrong for Georgia this year? I think expectations, because of the run Georgia had been on, had reached a certain point that becomes hard to hit year after year. And I think it was hard for a lot of people to maybe accept what was coming. And again, this it sounds like I'm talking about a team that went 6-6 here. I'm happy with Georgia's season overall. Am I glad they lost to Notre Dame? No. Do I wish they were still in the playoffs? Yes. Do I wish they could win a national championship? Yes. Am I going to put myself in a position as a fan where every single thing short of a national championship is a complete and utter failure? No, I'm just never going to do that to myself. I spent too much time making fun of Alabama fans for doing that, to turn around and now do it myself. Can I be disappointed at some individual performances? Can I be disappointed with some position groups or some coaching decisions or a player here or there, or the performance in a certain game? Of course I can. And do I want to see Georgia improve and get better? Of course I do. But do I think this was some kind of a complete, total failure of a season for Georgia? No, they won the SEC. I mean, let's not act like that's something that happens every day for Georgia. Georgia has won 5 SEC titles in the last 40 years. That's it. Not 10, not 15. That was Georgia's 5th SEC title in the last 40 years. 2024, 2022, 2017, 2005, 2002. That's 5. Before that, you got to go all the way back to 1982. So in the last 22 years, Georgia has won 5 SEC titles. So there's never going to be a season for me where Georgia wins an SEC title and I look at it as a complete and total failure. That's just not going to happen. Are there positions on this team that need to be improved upon from a talent and a production standpoint? Yes. Are there some coaching issues? Do some coaches need to be fired? Maybe. Mike Bobo is the scapegoat. There are fans that didn't like Mike Bobo from the day he was hired. I'm not convinced there's anything different Mike Bobo could have done this year to get any different result than what we got. In fact, I kind of look at it the opposite way. It's a miracle to me, given all the things I just described, particularly when it comes to the wide receivers and the offensive line and how bad they played versus expectation and potential, because potentially that offensive line is one of the best in the country. Potentially, all those wide receivers that we've been crapping on all year, they're all 4-star guys. Arian Smith's a 5-star in some places. These people just never lived up to their potential. They never they never figured it out. And I'm not convinced any offensive coordinator could have done any more with Georgia this year than what Mike Bobo did. Now, maybe they make a change there. I'm not against making a change at offensive coordinator. If we do make a change, I would prefer Georgia to bring in maybe a younger OC that has some experience working with mobile QBs, because I think Georgia needs to go that direction in their quarterback room. When you look around college football and even in the NFL, whether you want to talk about Josh Allen at the Bills, Patrick Mahomes with the Chiefs, Lamar Jackson with the Ravens, some of your best teams, the majority of your playoff teams in the NFL are mobile dual threat QBs. And that's something that I think Georgia has yet to fully embrace. Stetson Bennett could do some running around. Gunnar Stockton, who played in the Sugar Bowl, has the potential to, although for whatever reason they wouldn't let him do it in the Sugar Bowl, or he chose not to. We'll see what they do with that going forward if he's going to be the guy next year. So, I mean, I don't know. I on one hand, I look at Georgia coaching staff this year, and I think it might be the best coaching job at Georgia the entire time Kirby has been there, going all the way back to 2016. Because when you combine what we know now about this team with the record that they played, I don't know how they went 10-2. I don't know how they made the SEC championship game. I don't know how they won it, but they did. With a team that is way less talented than anything they've put on the field since before COVID. This team reminded me a lot more of 2018 and 2019 than it did of 21 and 22. So what went wrong for Georgia? Offensive line, wide receivers, quarterback turnovers in the middle of the season, running backs that aren't what we're used to seeing at UJ. Again, I don't think the running backs are bad. In fact, out of the offensive line, wide receivers, and running backs, I think the running backs are clearly the best of that group. But it's not Nick Chubb and Sony Michel. It's not DeAndre Swift and James Cook. It's just not. And maybe a little on the interior of the defensive line in terms of stuff in the run and the ability to defend a mobile quarterback. That's what went wrong. There you go. Let me know below what other teams you want to see me do. I've got a list of a few that I'm working on here, but what went wrong with some of these other teams, let me know down below. Again, I don't mean these videos to be shit talk or trash talk videos. I started with Georgia because, as you know, Georgia's my favorite team, and I didn't want to start with another team and people think that I was picking on another team instead of picking on my own team. Obviously, some things went very wrong with Georgia this year. I'm trying to point some of those out in this video here. And there's a couple other teams on my list too. But let me know down below which teams you want to see, and have a good morning.